And their commitment to culture as a bridge to environmental activism. So thank you again. As always, we thank the Alvarez family for their continued support of the MAS program. And a big thank you to Dr. Ana Maria Mutis, the organizer of an amazing seminar series, and of course to Housekeeping Membreño Centeno for her always organization and logistical support. Before we start our event, I would like to be intentional and respectful in acknowledging that Trinity University and the city of San Antonio are on the ancestral, traditional, and unceded lands of the Apache, Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Jumano, and Tonkawa nations. With gratitude to be in this space, we honor the original stewards of this land. Just some housekeeping details before we start our event. If you are participating via Zoom, you can leave your questions on the chat. If you are watching us via Tiger Network and on YouTube, share your questions and or comments via the comment section on YouTube. We will be sure to address as many questions as we can during our Q&A. Without further ado, let's hear from the organizer, Dr. Ana Maria Mutis. Thank you and hope you enjoyed the lecture.
Thank you very much, Dania. Welcome again to the final presentation of the MAS Alvarez Seminar 2022. This year's theme is Green Matters, Environmental Literature, Art, and Activism in Latin America and the Latinx World. We have had the participation of scholars from the environmental humanities who have explored how Latin American arts, practices, and theorizations engage the more than human world and represent environmental destruction. Today, we have the privilege to have with us a writer, Fernando Flores, a creator of fictional works that capture through fantasy, suspense, and sometimes horror, the harsh realities of the borderlands, including those that affect non-human beings and ecosystems. Fernando Flores was born in Reynosa, Tamaulipas, Mexico, and grew up in South Texas. He's the author of the collection entitled Death to the Bullshit Artists of South Texas, and the novel Tears of the Trufflepig, which was longlisted for the Center for Fiction First Novel Prize and named Best Book of 2019 by Tor.com. His fiction has appeared in the Los Angeles Review of Books, switch to Spanish. Again, Los Angeles Review of Books Quarterly, American Short Fiction, Ploughshares, Frieze, Porterhouse Review, and elsewhere. His collection of stories, Valleyesque, is forthcoming May 2022. Today's presentation consists of a reading by Fernando from his book, Tears of the Trufflepig, and from a short story from his forthcoming collection, Valleyesque, followed by a Q&A. So we remind people watching us on the live stream that they're invited to post their questions on YouTube. We will be monitoring those questions and also the ones posted in the chat on Zoom. So welcome, Fernando, to the MAS Alvarez Seminar. It is a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you so much for having me. It is a great honor to be invited to this series and to read a part of my novel, Tears of the Trufflepig, and to get a chance to talk about my work. So thank you so much, Ana Maria, and everyone at Trinity University for making this happen.
Fernando, would you like us to, since you're going to be reading from the novel first, would you like to give us like a short summary of the novel, or would you like me to do it, just so the people who have not finished it or have not read it yet, they have a sense of what it is about?
Totally, yes. So my novel, Tears of the Trufflepig, takes place like in an alternate reality, like kind of South Texas, where there's two border walls, and a controversial like third border wall about to be erected. And it's really about this widower who's wandering this landscape, who's looking for his brother who has disappeared and was kidnapped by the syndicates along the border, and who manipulate and use this technology called the filtering technology to kind of bring back these extinct species back to life, and to use, like, let's say they bring back like exotic birds, and they'll use like their feathers and stuff and use it for like the exotic black market, or they use the bird themselves, even though the animals only have like a life of like 6 weeks or so. They'll use them as like displayed, like rich people display them in their houses and stuff, or in like an art, in like exorbitant kind of art parties. So it's about this widower who's wandering this landscape in South Texas and gets involved with things that are way over his head. The excerpt that I was going to read. Oh, should I go ahead and
yes, and maybe set the scene for the excerpt and then read it.
Definitely. This is like in the first, and this takes place in the beginning of the novel, where our protagonist, Esteban Bellacosa, who's this middle-aged man, who's a widower who lost his wife and daughter in tragic circumstances, and who's kind of detached from his family. And this is when he first crosses into Mexico in this world. And so this is it. Here's in the Trufflepig. Here we go. 50 feet from the border, Bellacosa paid for the parking at the privately owned Nevada's lot, where the keg-shaped man working the booth recognized him. "How are things along the border today?" Bellacosa asked the man. "It's an orange alert day, but there's no shootings and no commotion, so I would say things are pretty okay." Bellacosa slipped him a few extra dollars and said, "Keep an eye out on my Jeep, okay?" "You got it, hermano." Bellacosa parked and walked to the pedestrian side of the International Bridge. The border protectors didn't have any tanks set up, and as Bellacosa walked to the toll booth, the armed officer handed him an illustrated pamphlet warning of the current dangers in Mexico. Bellacosa paid the toll with a crisp bill and crossed the bridge that took him into Reynosa, the first Mexican city directly across. Bellacosa threw the pamphlet away when he passed the first trash bin. He noticed that the lines of cars and pedestrians crossing back into MacArthur weren't very long as he ascended the arch of the bridge to make the leap over the river and the two border walls. Halfway over the Rio Grande, the fabric of the bridge changed. The Mexican half was built out of cobblestones and was slightly more vandalized. Bellacosa stopped at the bolted plaque commemorating the spot as the official divider of the two countries, and looked through the 10-foot chain link fence along the railing down at the river. He knew the Rio Grande naturally flowed eastward toward the Gulf, but Bellacosa swore it was running the opposite way. He watched as two children climbed the railing as high as his waist level to take a look. They were both pointing and smiling with a look of wonder Bellacosa hadn't seen in a child in so long that the sight nearly touched him, until he noticed the source of their amazement. It wasn't the water, but the two border walls, one built along the south side of the Rio Grande, the other along the north. And like two scheming sentinels, they escorted the river, their dying queen, as far as the eye could see into the horizon. The look of pleasure on the children's faces made his blood harden like lava in his veins. Suddenly, against the northern border wall, a few hundred yards away, a howling, tall flame sprung to life. The children clapped Bellacosa knew it was a controlled fire for the Great Cane, which threatened the structural integrity of the border walls, and he continued his walk. As he approached Mexican customs, there it was, one of the ancient giant Olmec head monuments for border crossers to see, carved to depict a long-dead Olmec king. It had been a gift from a previous Mexican president to the old mayor in Reynosa. Its presence on the international bridge was initially a huge controversy, critics demanding its return to the south where the Olmec people had lived. Bellacosa laughed when he had first seen it, but now he no longer saw the humor. The wonder the border walls failed to inspire came over him like a blue shadow as he stared at the giant Olmec head. It reminded him of the shrunken heads of Indians and the syndicates that lopped heads, shrank them, and sold them to sick collectors for exorbitant prices. Bellacosa was convinced the Olmecs predicted Mexico's present reality long ago, predicted the museums and private collectors abroad paying in gold for made-to-order shrunken heads from down south, with Indians now killing other Indians for their heads because they are left out on the margins of the modern world and have few recourses to feed their families. A price tag is now placed on every Indian's head to be mounted and encased, turned into conversation pieces at fancy cocktail parties, thrown by rich, trendy circles, calling themselves aficionados of the art and of ancient cultures. Bellacosa got in line behind about 8 people to pass through Mexican customs. He was perfectly composed, though he decided not to declare the American cash he was crossing over. When his turn came, the dark-skinned Mexican officers scanned Bellacosa's left palm. He got a green light, and they didn't search him. Bellacosa thanked the officers and let out a chuckle of relief. At 7:15 p.m., right on time, he saw a taxi painted green and red like a giant sliced watermelon. The driver was inside and the car's motor was running. When the driver saw him approach, he leaned out of the window and said, "Bellacosa, come on," in Spanish. Inside, as the taxi zoomed along La Zona Rosa, Bellacosa asked, "Are you Manolo Segura's friend, Videncio?" "Nah, I'm just a taxista. I was only hired to pick you up." Bellacosa was confused by this reply, but somehow trusted it. They sped over potholes and a long section of unpaved, muddy road. He saw a mustard-colored 2-story house with the second floor missing a big portion of the exterior walls. Inside was a living room set up and a woman breastfeeding a baby while watching a telenovela on a black and white replica. They passed a pharmacy with a pile of gravel next to the entrance and an old man dressed in a Western shirt and trousers, shoveling some of it onto a wooden wagon hitched to a station wagon vehicle. Curiously, at the soccer field, nobody was playing a game, but a group of boys ran around with bows and arrows made of sticks and strings. And Bellacosa wondered if there were others dressed like cowboys hiding in the brush. He took a good look at the driver's Japanese-style hat, his Hawaiian shirt, and listened to the voices and the static coming from the CB radio, turned down low. The taxi passed the abandoned Santa Fe de Edesa Cathedral, and Bellacosa crossed himself, telling the taxi driver, "Not a single dove on the steps of the church." When the driver didn't reply, Bellacosa felt slightly ashamed at having crossed himself. It was a subconscious Catholic gesture he'd renounced after his daughter's death and picked up years later when it was his wife who'd passed away. Bellacosa then recalled what El Gordo Pacheco had said in his famous recorded statement, how he considered himself to be a man who dealt in commodities. The statement had surprised him. As a freelance buyer for these Mexican contractors and being Don Villaseñor's confidence man, the one he called when he needed a rare piece of machinery, fast. This was the way Bellacosa also described his own trade. He was a man who dealt in commodities. Me and Pacheco, Bellacosa whispered, we both think highly of our damned selves. At a light, he saw a newspaper vendor waving a copy of Hoy Mismo in the air, which documented the latest atrocities in the filtering syndicate wars. A massive grave had been found outside Reynosa by the mountains, and the authorities believed it contained the headless bodies of the first-year biology students from Universidad La Reforma, who had gone missing the previous semester. Though DNA tests were pending, the people of Reynosa were at a loss as to how to react to this iniquitous, unfathomable revelation. Looking at the gruesome front-page photograph as the vendor waved it around and hollered, Bellacosa could no longer feel shocked. However, there was always a sadness in him that could unroll like a carpet of damp autumn leaves if he let his emotions wander too far into sentimentality. Though Bellacosa had been raised in Reynosa, too much had changed in the decades since he'd moved away. It was the city where he'd learned to make a peso, where he first saw what a blue-eyed girl and an American dollar looked like. But he no longer felt the town was a part of him, more of a reflection at the bad end of a cursed-looking glass. And he romanticized the old image of the city, in which doves and pigeons still flap their wings. He chewed on an energy booster pill with papaya enzymes as the driver sadistically scratched the back of his own neck and the taxi hurled over railroad tracks. Recently, Bellacosa had discovered something slightly unsettling about himself, that he neither liked nor disliked all these Mexicans and Americans living along both sides of the border. He saw them now as one and the same people, both stale imitations of the cultures they were meant to be a part of. This revelation neither disappointed nor astonished him. It was simply how he felt. The border walls, the filtering syndicates, the headless bodies of scientists, shrunken Indian heads. He felt these things were always around even before they materialized. It was all the continuous overflow of the tension that had been boiling for over a century along the border. Thank you so much. That was a short excerpt from my debut novel, Tears of the Trufflepig.
Thank you very much, Fernando. That was wonderful. I don't know if we already have any questions in the YouTube. We don't have any yet in the chat.
It's okay. I was also going to read an excerpt from my forthcoming collection of short stories, and that will conclude the portion of the reading for the evening. And this is from my forthcoming collection, Valleyesque. Comes out on May 3rd. You know, the art was designed by Na Kim. She painted this by hand. She painted both my covers by hand. I'm so lucky to have such wonderful, talented people behind me. So this will be This is the first short story from my forthcoming collection of short stories, Valleyesque. And the title of this story is called Queso, completely different style and mood from Tears in the Trufflepig, which is the advantage of a short story collection. You can do all kinds of different things. So first short story from Valleyesque, Queso. Watching the news on television, Marcos yelled, "That anchor's face ain't real," and hurled an empty glass. The glass bounced off the TV screen and curiously neither shattered. Pissed as hell, he walked to the kitchen and brushed his teeth over the sink. It rained as he got on the bus, and Marco scanned his found student ID that let him ride for free. At the job interview, the general manager asked him to describe his talents and ambitions in the most creative, non-misogynist way and explain why she should give him the job. Marco said to her, Willie was the only other Mexican in East Kingsville, and one day he held a ripe red orange to a butcher's nose and made him describe the smell of the motherland on his fingers. The butcher was also Mexican, of no relation. Very good, said the general manager, marking off a box on the resume. Now, here at this job, we are a tightly knit community. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you describe your collaboration with others upon encountering a tough situation? Well, first you wring the neck of the big turkey till it flops. Then you make a soup from the rest and feed it to the others, slowly watching them eat, greedily offering them more water and more bread. Wait until afterward to bring up their sisters in the war. Excellent, Mr. Marcos. And using the same scale of 1 to 10, tell me something you think you could improve, either in your work ethic or personal integrity. There's nothing safer than a shark to ride. Tape notes under the table. I'll learn the ropes, the insides and outsides of this trade. Just give me the chance, and I'll have a mind for the books and how to make money disappear. Piles will wheelbarrow out the back or from the bottle, and you'll never even know. Then I'll bring the horses in and forget about it. Give me the pies, give them. All right, Mr. Marcos, looks like we got what we need. Thank you so much for the opportunity to interview you. We'll get back to you by the end of the day. When the boss read the application, he thought out loud to himself, all I want is to have a place where anybody can just walk right in and order a bowl of melted cheese. And we'll throw in some spices for flavor. They'll be served with hardened broken tortillas. Chips, we'll call them. And people can dip the hardened tortilla chips into this melted cheese when they're having a good time. We'll call the cheese queso, not pronounced Mexican, but queso. The trick I've learned from the best is that you gotta co-opt their culture, hijack it, and sell them back a cheaper version. An authentic experience that's better, faster than the real thing. We'll also make our version of what they call breakfast tacos and serve them round the clock. To save time, the tortillas will be pre-made, possibly purchased in bulk and at a discount from a provider. The eggs, they'll have to be already cracked in a container and poured on the grill upon getting ordered. This touch is important. It is what will let us advertise them as fresh. Every taco will also come sprinkled with cheese. Unless otherwise specified, the standard is that every taco we topped off with this cheese, American, and just shredded over, but pre-shredded also. The American cheese will have to be pre-shredded. Yes, that goes without saying. And this young man, he's gonna be the one going them. We'll start him on the graveyard shift and take it from there. Thank you. That was the first short story in my forthcoming collection.
Thank you very much. This is so interesting, your first story, because one of the questions I was planning to ask you without having read this short story is about food, because I noticed, or we noticed in the class when we discussed your novel, that food is central to the novel, and now to this short story as well. You know, food production, food consumption, the banquet, the feast, the very extravagant dinner parties. Why did you choose the topic of food? Why does it resonate with you?
Maybe, I never thought about that aspect of my work, but maybe, I worked in the food service industry for most of my life, oh my God, throughout my 20s for like a decade. I stopped working, being a barista when I was 32 in 2014. So maybe that, working in restaurants, learning about food, the absurdity of like foodie culture, and seeing that as like a thing, and trying to incorporate it into what is going on. Often when you read books, you never get an idea even that characters are reading. I mean, are like eating or even like, or consuming media and stuff like that. So like food and like media, like what's on the radio or like a movie or something, all these things are really important, like ingredients for the novel to bring it to life in some kind of way, and it's also an opportunity for me as a writer to make things up. I'm a big fan of the mid-20th century writer, MFK Fisher, who wrote about food. One of my favorite books of all time is by her. It's also one of my favorite titles of all time, How to Cook a Wolf. It's a great book, like memoiristic, where she gives you recipes within the work, and I like that when books like, when you're reading something and it teaches you how to do something, it teaches you something, or you learn something about like the food that is in that area, so so perhaps that is reason why, just being around it and being in the food service industry, and making the observation that these things aren't normally in novels. And whenever I notice that something isn't in a novel, like perhaps sometimes there's a certain kind of novel that is very stark and doesn't have any humor, I'm like, I'm going to try to approach these difficult subjects and to add a little bit of humor, because in our situation, those of us that have been around death and stuff like that, that it's not always, there's weird moments of laughing, and stuff like that. So I don't want these moments to be lost within stories, like within our stories,
Yes, there is a question here. Would you describe your observations in literature as Austinian, meaning from Austin, considering the critical reading you provide about food culture from your location in Austin?
Again, like, I worked like in kitchens, like I worked in a fancy restaurant, washing dishes, you learn a lot just washing dishes, washing strangers' dishes for hours and hours at a time, so maybe that's a task, but it's like a subconscious thing too. I think that writing, the way I approach writing is in a very performative way. Like I am very much aware of my surroundings and what's going on, and the tragedies of my experience and the experience of others and my peers, so especially since I don't write autobiographical fiction, I don't write direct autobiographical fiction, but these subtle little elements that you would call autobiographical are snuck in there. And that's what's interesting to me as a writer,
You mentioned your writing process, your creative process, and I read somewhere that you wrote the novel in 3 months. Is that true? And how did you accomplish that? How did the idea come to you?
yeah, it was a combination. It was a series of events, I guess, that all happened very quickly for me. And, after writing for a long time, for almost 10 years, I finally got a little bit of attention. And the great San Antonio writer who recently passed away, the late Greg Barrios, nominated me for what was then the Cinderos del Moral Prize off of reading a story from my first book, That's to the Bullshit Artists of South Texas. He nominated me, and I didn't win. I got nominated. I got honorable mention, but I was given $10,000. And I was given $10,000 the first time in my life. I'm like, oh my God, I never made it more than $19,000 in my whole life. I was 32 years old, And also my mother had recently passed away. 8 months prior to that or so, my mother had passed away. And I hadn't really written much, because of that experience. So after I got that money, and the same week that I got the money, I was laid off from my barista job, my independent coffee shop barista job. And I was hired at a bookstore to work only 2 days a week. So I was like, oh my God, this has never happened to me before. I've never had the time to write. I've always written around my work and everything. So I was given those $10,000 and I was working 2 days a week. And so me, it was like now or never. It was like, it's now or never. I had a dog, my dog at the time. I had a dog for 5 years at the time, and I hadn't taken him to a vet ever. And I finally took him to the vet, and I paid for it with some of that money. And it was like $700. I remember, boom, paying $700. And in that moment, it dawned on me that the money was going to run out. The money was going to run out one day, and I'm either going to have something to show for it or not. So based on that fear, and I'm finally having the time to write, I'm like, I got to write something. And I had this manuscript that I had unfinished that was like 200,000 words. I could have revised it. That was a very autobiographical in the first person, mostly about my experience. And I'm like, and am I going to use this time to revise this, or to do something, or to go take a dive into the unknown, to do the complete unknown? And somehow the unknown seemed appealing to me. So I had this. So, right before this experience, when I was sitting around my room one day, I hadn't written in a long time. I hadn't gotten this award yet. I was months away from getting this award. My mother had died, and I was sitting in this room, and I had this vision of the Trufflepig, of this creature, and I was like, what does this creature mean, And I thought about the platypus, how the platypus is looks like a combination of beings, And I thought of the predominant animals that exist in this land, in Texas, and around the border. And they're mostly like beaked animals, reptilian skinned animals, or hooved animals. And I thought of a creature that would embody all those things and that would symbolize something about the Southwest in this. And I also had this idea of the border walls. This was before, Trump even announced his candidacy, before the border wall became a thing. But it's always been like a thing in my life. I'm from the border. People have been always talking about it. So I thought it would be farcical to have like this landscape with two border walls and this widower just wandering this landscape. And eventually I realized that the story of the Trufflepig and the story of this widower are the exact same story. And I had to figure out how I was going to do that. So starting this story, when I started writing Tears of the Trufflepig, I knew I was going to eventually have to mention the Trufflepig. I had to get there. But how I was going to get there and what was going to happen, I had no clue. Every day for 3 months, out of those 3 months, from October 2014 to January 6th, 2015, when I wrote this book, there were only about 7 or 6 days where I did not write. Because of the fear, too. I wake up in the middle of the night, like not knowing what I was going to do or what was going to happen the next day. And I listened to this song over and over every day before I wrote. It's called Circling Pigeon Waltz. I mentioned it in the acknowledgments of the book in the back. I listened to the song and I paced around like a maniac over and over, And I had this vision of Kafka. I don't know if like Kafka has a book called America. And it's an unfinished book. It was his first novel. It's called America. And he never came to America, but it's this like his imaginative America. And when he when the main character, I think it's Joseph K, is approaching like the Statue of Liberty, it has like a flaming sword or something, you know? So all these subtly like things about America that are not real that he put in his book. But the book ends with the main character seeing like a play on stage of like a Western play, a Western style like play, and him being like enamored with it and joining the theater troupe and going down to the South. And it ends, the novel ends, he never finished it. So I always thought, man, it would be funny if somebody, you know, this kid, I'm like, well, it would be funny if like Kafka like didn't die. And if Kafka like emigrated to the United States, and if Kafka like somehow made it to like Texas in his middle age and had a family like in San Antonio, and now had like kids, and I'm like, what would Kafka see in this land? You know, what kind of stories would come from that? You know, so this is my inspiration when Tears of the Trufflepig. These Czech ideas, you know, with this song circling its Pigeons Waltz, you know, that I kept listening to over and over. It was performed by an immigrant Czech band, and to me it sounds like Tejano. So to me it sounds like Tejano. You listen to it, it's like okay, this like Czech immigrant music combining with the indigenous music that existed in Texas at the time to create this music. So I wanted to make that infusion with literature, to create these things, these ideas that Kafka did, and to bring it to this landscape, to approach it like nobody had in literature that I've ever read, you know.
And you mentioned the pigeons, and there are no birds and no pigeons in Tears of the Trufflepig, right? So I can see that connection. When I emailed you the first time, and I invited you to participate in this seminar, and I mentioned the environmental aspect of the novel, you said that not many critics have noted that. So I'm going to ask you, why do you think that is? And did you approach this project with the environment in mind?
You know, I think that it's
as one of the many aspects that clearly made it into the novel. But did you think about that too?
The environmental, yeah, it was impossible for me not to, you know. To me, it's always really interesting how we can separate the environment from us, you know. We live in this hunk of rock floating in space, you know, right as we're speaking, we're in this hunk of rock floating in space, and it's a miracle that all this really exists. Somehow we're able to separate all that from this moment. And to me, that's incredible. You know, it's incredible that we're able to compartmentalize those two things where we clearly live within inside it, you know. So to me, I really had to analyze these things and how they would happen. You know, I'm like, okay, if you artificially create life, if you artificially manufacturing life and it's imperfect, how would that affect the environment? How would that affect actual living creatures in the environment, you know? So to me, these things had to have a dialogue, and I really had to, you know, for lack of a better word, meditate on these aspects of the book, you know, on these aspects of this reality, you know. I really took it, to me, I took my approach in writing this book was more almost like a research paper into the subconscious. I had to really go in there and really extract the meaning of these things and put them together into a book, you know, into a book that was easy to read, and that I snuck in, or in a way smuggled in all these concepts and things in there to the reader, you know. I tried to do it under people's noses, you know. So in a way, I celebrate that people don't really notice, because it's like in the background. It's like the iceberg, you know, the novel itself is the iceberg on the novel, like is all on the bottom. It's a huge iceberg, you know. And I really do also feel that if you look at what we call like Mexican American or Latinx or border literature, it hasn't been that many writers who have been allowed to explore fantastical storytelling, you know, or storytelling outside of stark realism. You know, we usually see these stark realist dramas, there's story or novels or short stories that are about like generational conflicts, and those stories are very important to tell. But I feel that this is the predominant form of storytelling that exists for this region. And I feel that this is a very unjust sense of the wind, of time, and all of everything around us, probably, you know. And really storytelling, like what we call novels, has really existed for like 500 years, you know. And what were those storytellings that died before the written word, which was the oral storytelling tradition, you know? And to devalue the type of storytelling that the oral tradition brought, which were these fantastical kind of elements, and to say that only what is literary is only these stark realist things, is a huge, almost like colonization of the imagination to me, you know, that is unacknowledged by the literary world, or really like publishing world, or like academia, or really like unstudied. You know, I feel like the history of the imagination is something that is important and not really studied, in my opinion.
Definitely. There's a question here from Dr. Heather Sullivan. I lost it. She says, thank you for the wonderful reading. It was a great pleasure to read your novel and consider it in terms of the environment at the border. I'm very interested in the question of genetic modification of animals and foods. Can you say more about those modifications and the horror of the treatment of the trufflepigs, for example? Love the awful dinner party scene.
Yes, well, to me, it was very complicated to navigate all these things. I was like, all right, if this technology existed and it fell into the wrong hands, what is the worst thing you could possibly do? And like, all right, you know, you start bringing these things back to life and exploiting it as much as you can, you know, making the most money out of you can. If you could bring an extinct species back to life and it only existed for 4 weeks, after 4 weeks it died because it's imperfect, how many people would pay a ton of money just to have it around, And let's say you could eventually, that technology moved, if you could manufacture creatures of the imagination. Let's say you could, if somebody could manufacture a unicorn, and even if that unicorn could only exist for a month and just die this terrible death, so many people would just pay so much money just to have it around, to throw parties, to have your kid riding it and throw pictures and stuff like that. You know, it'll be worth billions. It will fall into the wrong hands, you know? So I really thought about these things very carefully. The thinking about these things lasted more than the actual writing. And this was what me pacing around, listening to the song over and over consisted of, me trying to piece these things, this reality together. Because I don't take it for granted. To me, I'm not making things up. I'm not making things up as I'm writing. To me, I'm kind of getting in touch with a story that already exists and trying to harness it into a novel. You know, to me, like what happens to me, the Trufflepig came to me and told me to tell this story. You know, that's pretty much what it is. I feel like the least important aspect of this novel, even though I wrote it, I feel like the least important aspect of it existing. You know, like I'm grateful that it exists and it came to me. It's a mystery to me sometimes, you know, like it got optioned and to be made into a movie, and the screenwriters sometimes ask me questions and I'm like, wow, like ask me these horrible questions about something that I did in it, something that happens in it. And I'm like, I'm like, oh my God, I can't believe I did that. Like I don't have a like psychic connection to it anymore, you know? So I really have to get into that world and think about it now, because I feel, like I said, that I feel like I'm just a participant in the bringing this novel back to life, I guess, you know.
And by the way, she also added to this question that she's very excited to hear about Kafka influence and the environmental fact of our immersion in the world.
Thank you. No, I'm sorry. Yeah.
No, go ahead.
No, I was just going to, talk about like literature and like like I said, like how, how Czech people moved to like Texas and stuff like that, and that kind of storytelling, and like Kafka, and that connection. I feel, all of us know that there's more to Texas. Texas is weird. There's all these weird things that are unacknowledged. Like recently, I learned about like a donkey lady, this myth in San Antonio or whatever the hell. I don't know. You guys probably know more than me about the donkey lady, but to me, I'm like, oh my God, please. And I asked my friend who's older about donkey lady. He said he knows all about it. I guess it's like an older generation. I'm sure people from San Antonio from here would know about donkey lady. But anyway, like these weird aspects of our culture here in this land that are unacknowledged and not present in Texas literature. We're thinking about Texas literature, we just think about Lonesome Dove, which I love Larry McMurtry, all that stuff. But when we talk about Texas, we think about that, and like we think about these westerns, and we think about, I don't know, what do we think about really? So I'm trying to broaden, I guess, the idea of our definition of what literature of this land is and what can do,
Yes, definitely. There's a question from one of my students who you're going to meet tomorrow in our class. Maria Zaratos asks, hello, I'm looking forward to reading your short story collection and appreciate your rich and honest writing. My question is, what inspired you to write Tears of the Trufflepig? And how did dreams play a role in your process?
I once heard the great filmmaker Francis Ford Coppola say that whenever he's making a movie, he tries to have one word to go back to remember what his movie is about. For instance, justice. Like when he was making Apocalypse Now, he's like, okay, and lost grasp what this movie is about. He'll always remember, okay, it's about justice, about the skewed sense of justice, and all these things. So when I was writing this book, like I said, like about 8 months or like almost like a year, like 10 to 12 months from when I started writing it, my mother passed away. And I really wanted to write about death, but in a way that I wasn't direct and wasn't really about death, I wanted to write about death like nobody had written about death before, in a way that was interesting and exciting for me to excavate as a writer, these themes. So with the idea of the truffle pig and dealing with this widower, I don't want to give a lot away. I don't know how many people have read the book or want to read the book or not, but I knew that this book, when writing this book, I knew that this book was, I guess I went back to three things. This book was about death, and it was about reality, and it was about dreams, and how those three things correlate together, how dreams can perhaps help us in the mourning process of death, and what reality really is, what reality really is, what reality really could have been, Sometimes when somebody who is problematic passes away, and we think only, like in our families or in larger culture, a culture at large, when somebody problematic passes away who was probably talented or maybe dear to us in our lives, we only remember these positive things about them. Or like somebody in our lives who we had a difficult relationship with passes away, and after the passage of time, we glamorize what it could be if they were still with us, without remembering the difficulties, So I was interested in these themes and these ideas when approaching this novel and this character and the tragedy of this character, and how this character experiences through the things going on around him with the truffle pig, which is with the syndicates, with his brother, with the indigenous people of South Texas in the novel, and how all these things in our environment help us in our mourning or in our personal lives, and how little incidents, can inform our personal experience, And I know these are very esoteric and broad things, and then you'll read the book but I really did try to harness all these things into a very readable, entertaining way,
Oh, very entertaining. I was going to ask you, you talk about dreams and death. And I remember this moment in the novel that where they're experimenting on Bellacosa, and he wakes up in as if his wife had not died and his daughter had not died, and he starts living the life he would have lived had this not happened. And it reminded me, and I don't know if you thought about that or not, I'm just curious. It reminded me of Borges and Cortázar. They have two short stories where two realities sort of overlap, and you kind of don't know which one is the truth and which one is the dream. La Noche Boca Arriba by Cortázar and El Sur by Borges. And you quote Borges. It's your epigraph, the Milonga de Don Nicanor Paredes by Borges. So I guess my question would be, how much of an influence is Latin American literature, and what are your authors what are the authors that inspire you the most?
Well, that Borges epigraph, haunted me for a long time, right? Way before the novel, it reminded me of the Mexican men of my father's generation, who lived through a certain time in Mexico, before their economy collapsed in the early 90s, who lived through this experience, and that I was able to witness, And this quote kind of reminded me of that, it reminded me of like the hustle, I'm like, and like my father being retired, or that kind of Mexican man being retired and like not having the hustle anymore and missing the hustle, missing the hustle of it, And I really, so Borges, I didn't read Borges when I was 20 years old, and in my early 20s, I tried to read Borges. I couldn't do it. I'm like, I don't understand it. I couldn't understand it. Then one day when I was like in my late 20s, I was 28, I got the complete Borges, everything Borges did. I read, and I read 2 short stories a day. And finally I got it. Finally it clicked with me, and I became a huge Borges fan. I'm always rereading Borges. By now I've read it all. I've read all his poetry, all his essays, all his fiction. So to me, it was very important it's great how, Spanish language literature has a figure like Borges in their canon, We don't, like in English language, American literature, we don't have somebody who is that esoteric and that, experimental in his short stories, And so to me, it was really a revelation finding these things. And so, in Cortázar, a little less so, but of course, I can't escape that influence that he has, the ability for him to turn his stories inside out. I'm a big fan of, also Silvina Ocampo, who gets overshadowed in that group as well. So I'm a big fan of Silvina Ocampo, together. And also, Adolfo Bioy Cázares, who wrote The Invention of Morale. To me, The Invention of Morale is one of the greatest books of all time that almost nobody has read, It's a little book. It's like 90 pages long. But in this book, like, he invents so many things. He invents, or he foreshadows. He was written like in the late 30s, if I'm not mistaken. And he foreshadows like reality TV, virtual reality, all these concepts that wouldn't be invented until 30, 40 years later. So to me, that was fascinating. It's fascinating how I had never heard of it, how nobody ever talked about it, I guess, then. So I really took in these canonical Spanish language and Czech and German literature and brought those aesthetics into my world, instead of being influenced by the literature that already comes from here. Even though I of course I am influenced by a lot of it, I just wrote an essay on novel that I admire very much by Genaro Gonzalez that almost nobody's read called The Quixote Cult, published in 1998. That is a unique and one-of-a-kind novel I think that more people should read. But I try to, like I said, bring all these aesthetics to our storytelling that I never saw, And to me, publishing wasn't a guarantee. Like I didn't know writing these crazy stories that anybody would ever publish them. And I didn't care really. To me, it was hilarious if somebody rejected me because I thought I was doing something that nobody had done at the time, and that's not for me to say. I'm just telling you my perception at the time. I'm not claiming these things. I'm just telling you my mentality of when I was writing it, And I still try to do that with my work. I still why write anything? I ask myself, why write a book? So many books. And there's more books that have ever existed in the history of history, really, than now. So I don't do it. I don't do it unless I have the urge and I feel I can do something completely unique that nobody else can do,
There's a question from Dr. Abreu Torres. Dr. Abreu Torres, would you like to ask the question? It's written here, but she's in the meeting.
Okay.
Oh,
see it.
Let's see. Yes.
Let me go to the chat because I had two questions and I'm not sure which one you are referring to. The last one is as a writer and literary messenger, your purpose as a writer, what would you like the audience to take from your novels and stories?
I'm not sure if I have a message like that, to be honest, I want to be able to tell stories that nobody has approached, I want to be able to tell the stories that I've observed and experienced and nobody else could tell, and I'm lucky to be able to be in this position, to be honest. I never thought that I'd be a published author. I always thought that, I never expected, to be honest. To me, I always feel like a horse player that made it big on the horses, and I can't believe it most of the time, that I am given this opportunity, So any kind of readership, any kind of, if my work is able to, trigger a flame in somebody's, that realize, oh my God, the storytelling is much more than what I thought it was, which is what happened to me. I didn't really realize I wanted to be a writer till I was like 20 years old after I'd been reading all these things. And I discovered that there was a whole branches of literature that I was never made aware of in my short-lived academic life, So, what happens outside of, so I guess my message is always, and this is always me as as a college dropout, that is a novelist, I think that, the only thing I can say is that what you do outside of academia is more important than what you do in is just as important, what you learn of the research that you do is just as important for your work, and to make time for your work, and to make time for reading too, it's important for us to broaden our aesthetics and to read literature in translation as well, not just American literature.
And you had another question. Do we have time for the other question?
I'm open for as much time as possible, you guys all.
Tanya, go ahead.
I think so. Let me go back.
So do you believe? It's the question.
Oh, yeah, it was about, you were talking about dystopian literature. And I was wondering if you think if dystopian literature, or sci-fi literature should be the next thing in the Latinx literature, given that we have, like you mentioned, all these stories about historical background, historical perspectives. Wouldn't be sci-fi or dystopian literature the next thing, the next step to kind of reflect on Latinx identity and history?
Perhaps, but a lot of it, I think, also depends on like the publishing world. Unfortunately, like I know that the YA world is like rich in diversity, much more rich in diversity than the literary fiction world that I'm a part of. If you look at the landscape of literary fiction and see like the authors that identify as Latinx or Mexican American or Chicanx, and the kind of work that they are producing, like how much of it is considered like literary science fiction with a literary bent. There's almost none of it out there. There's just huge scarcity of it. I think that it's important for writers of all backgrounds to explore different ways of storytelling, because storytelling is not just this streamlined thing, that we all take a shot of revive of this style. It's not that. Storytelling is much more complex, especially if we come from a culture that comes from an oral storytelling tradition that was predominantly cut off in the beginning of the 20th century. These storytelling traditions slowly started dying off unless people documented them. So even though a lot of these stories are lost and we can't really read them in a book, we can really like learn about the type of storytelling that existed and how we can bring these elements into our kind of new storytelling today, whether literary fiction or anything, and to incorporate these things and to also make our literature branch out, and to not make it less homogenous, and that's what I'm all about, making things diversity is more than just having just people of color publish. You're like, if you look at a group of people of color like who are published by the same press or like a big press, you're like, okay, what kind of literature are they writing? What are the aesthetics that are here? Are they different? Are they doing pretty much the same thing but with a different perspective? I think that is very important to be given permission by big publishers and agents to be crazy and do weird things, and to approach our stories and our traumas and our visions and our hopes in these new innovative ways, and to give yourself room to fail too. If you're a writer, to give yourself room to fail. Who cares? Just words on a page that can be fixed, But finish it. Just finish your project. That's it. That's the most important thing always.
Oh, for sure. Finish your project. I think we're out of time right now. Our time is up. So this was a very enjoyable discussion. Thank you, Fernando, for participating in the Mas Alvarez seminar. There will be more questions tomorrow in our session during the class. So I'm looking forward to that. And thank you again for participating in this event.
Thank you all so much for y'all's generosity and wonderful questions. I really look forward to tomorrow's event. And I wish everybody a good night. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Have a good night.